Time is now 6 o'clock, so members, if you've all got your devices ready, able and open, I think we'll proceed. So I'll be welcoming members of the public and those viewing on live stream or watching afterwards. Please can I remind you that face masks should be worn at all times when moving around the building. I believe now the advice has been updated that we can sit here without them on. In the event of evacuation alarm sounding, everyone should vacate the building through the nearest exit and proceed directly to the assembly point. So if we begin tonight's meeting at item number 1, do we have any apologies for absence?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, we have apologies from Councillor Jones, and Councillor Hemorrhage is attending as substitute.
Thank you very much. Most welcome as well. So item 2, declarations of interest. Are there any? Smashing. We're doing so well, so quickly. Right, well, we'll move quickly on to item number 3, which was minutes of the last meeting, which I don't think I can propose or second, as I wasn't here. But if anybody would like to make any comment about the meeting, or are we happy to take a proposer and a seconder for that? Okay. Thank you, Councillor Allen, Councillor Jamil. So we'll note those as being an accurate record of the meetings held on February 2021, as set out in the agenda as a correct record. So we've done that. Okay, item number 4 then, which is a review of the Peterborough City Council Code of Conduct. And we've got double trouble in terms of double the value tonight. It's Fiona McMillan and Amy Brown, both from the legal team. So would you like to introduce either of you or comment together? So we get value for money, of course, tonight for this item agenda.
Thank you, Chair. I will be leading on this one, and Amy will do the next one. So we are splitting it tonight. So members, those of you that were on the committee before the elections will remember that we've looked at this once already. The draft code of conduct from the LGA was issued just before Christmas last year, and we have been waiting for guidance, which was due to be published alongside the model code, which was published this week and which has been sent on to you via email. So we now have the full thing to look at. So when you looked at it in March meeting, February meeting, we had an initial look at it, and I set out where it differed from Peterborough's current code. So Peterborough adopted its current code back in 2012, when the Localism Act 2011 abolished the previous standards regime, and along with the Standards Board for England, which was a national body, which all complaints about breaches of the Code of Conduct were sent to. So in its place, the Localism Act required councils to adopt a code of conduct and have in place arrangements for dealing with breaches of it. At that time, I understand that Peterborough reviewed its own arrangements and agreed the light touch alternative, which was consistent with what is now the MHCLG's suggested approach at the time. There have been a number of reviews over the years with bits added to it, but essentially it was what was known as the light touch code. The Committee on Standards and Public Life undertook a review of local government ethical standards in January 2018, and the report was published on January 2019. And in it, the recommendation was that the Local Government Association should create a new updated model code of conduct in consultation with all the representative bodies of councillors and officers in all tiers of local government. So the model code of conduct was published on the 23rd of December. It has a number of changes from what is currently in place at Peterborough, which, as I said, is basically the Nolan principles plus the requirements on interest, both disclosable pecuniary interests and the section that was added to the Peterborough Code on other interests. So it's introducing sections on on respect, on bullying and harassment, on confidentiality, impartiality of officers, disrepute, using your position to gain an advantage or disadvantage, misusing council resources, and undertaking training where requested on an annual basis. The sections on interests are the ones that are based on the Localism Act are the same as what we've got in the current code. The sections on other registrable interests are very similar to what we have in our Peterborough Code as well, just called a slightly different name. So the new sections are essentially, for those of you that were councillors before 2012, are essentially what was in the code before 2012. I think those of you that were here then will remember that. So the wording, distribute, and so on, they're a little bit different, but they're essentially bringing back those essential standards of conduct that the Committee on Standards in Public Life and the Local Government Association now would like to see in place in our codes. So, Committee on Standards in Public Life have written to every council individually and asked them to review their code, to send them details of what's in our current code and what we're doing about changing it to bring it in line with their recommendations. So they will be expecting, they're expecting councils to review them and, where possible, adopt the new model code. So, having said that, it's still a matter for each council to agree what goes in their code. This is what's recommended, but it is still a matter for you at the end of the day whether you agree that these sections should go back into the Peterborough Code. There was the Scrutiny Task and Finish group did look at this as well prior to the election, and they wholeheartedly recommended that Peterborough adopt the new model code, and they added a couple of bits to the model code, which on your agenda packs on the clean version is at, let me just see, page 42 of your agenda pack. So they wanted the addition of the wording at 3.1.2 on bullying, harassment and discrimination, that they wanted to add additional wording, the above should apply particularly at full council meetings. And they also wanted the wording at page 44 of your agenda packs in section 4, complying with the Code of Conduct. So where the model code says, as a councillor I undertake Code of Conduct training provided by my authority, they wanted the wording on an annual basis and apply its principles in all aspects of my work as a councillor. So those are the two suggestions from the Task and Finish group. I think that's probably it in terms of an introduction, so I don't know whether you want me to take through section by section. We have already looked at it section by section previously, but obviously we've got new committee members.
I don't believe so, unless there's an overwhelming desire to do so, because, as you say, it's been gone through already. It contains a lot of the information in terms of, even if it's not exactly the right wording, from the previous code, but happy to take questions, Fiona, for you. Nick Sanford, please.
Yeah, it's probably more comments rather than questions, actually, because I am one of those councillors who was on the council before 2012. I think that there are a few others here as well. I think I was one who very much favoured moving away from the highly prescriptive code of conduct that we had up to 2010 and moving towards a more light touch approach, which I think was the one we adopted round about 2012, because I think that just basically set out some clear principles in which should govern the way that councillors behave, and left it open to the legal officers at the council and other councillors to interpret it. The reason I favoured that approach was that I don't know if even those of you who weren't councillors can remember what happened before 2010 when we had a legally prescribed code of conduct. We had a national standards board that could impose some quite draconian sanctions, like suspending councillors for considerable periods, and the whole system got completely bogged down in a whole series of tit-for-tat complaints with Councillor X alleging that Councillor Y had brought the council into disrepute and behaved in an appalling way. And the whole system became discredited to such an extent that both the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats in the 2010 general election stood on a platform of abolishing the entire system completely. But so I do have concerns, and some of the things I have particular concerns about is some of the sections that have been brought in about bringing the council into disrepute, because you know, who defines what disrepute is? It talks of in the wording, and I've actually read the LGA guidance on it as well, and it talks about, you know, in the opinion of a member of the public, that a councillor's behaviour lowers the opinion in which they would hold the council or the councillor. And you know, you could argue that'd be quite difficult because a lot of people have a very low opinion of councillors anyway. But I think it's very subjective, it's very open to interpretation. But having said all that, you know, I do think, you know, we do have these independent bodies like the Committee for Standards in Public Life. You know, they've recommended that the LGA should have a look at it and draw up a draft code of conduct. We've had an internal council working group that's looked at it and who've made various changes to it. So I think my conclusion really is that we should go with what has been proposed. But when I look at the final item on the agenda of this meeting about the report of a tit-for-tat spat between two councillors, I do have some concerns that will this take us into a situation where we end up with more of those complaints. But I think we'll probably just have to try it and see. So I do, with some reluctance, say that we should agree what is actually on the table.
You will be pleased to know, Nick, that I raised the very same question in my pre-meeting with officers to talk about the agenda, but I won't take the thunder. Fiona will explain what the answer was, which is perhaps different than what we were used to previously.
Yeah, I think where the situation differs is that although this is bringing back a lot of the elements of the old code, the system that sits around that will be different because we don't have the national body standards for England anymore, and it's local determination. So ultimately, where there is a complaint and it goes and there is an apparent breach, there's an investigation, and that comes back to you as a panel of this committee to decide ultimately whether or not something has brought the council into disrepute. So the power is in your hands in terms of making that judgment. Ultimately, a finding of breach will be in your power if there's a hearing to determine whether or not that's the case. And previously, it was determined by a national body that you had no influence over. So that's the distinction.
Just really want to add one further point, which is that I was talking to Councillor Shahid, who was our representative on the working group that looked into this, and what, you know, he broadly agreed with the proposals, but he said, one of the things he said to me was, well, but what is the point of it all if there aren't any sanctions? So I think, you know, I think there is, we do need to look at what expectations we're creating as a result of this, and if members of the public see there is this really prescriptive code with, you know, all of these paragraphs in it, but when they make a complaint, they see that nothing happens, I think that is probably problematical. But I understand, isn't the government looking at the whole issue of sanctions?
I think Fiona just wants to reply to that point, Nick, and then I'll come to you in a second.
Yes, so clearly sanctions are the sort of elephant in the room when it comes to code of conduct and whatever we've got in place. There are sanctions available, but they are apology, training, and a formal censure by council or removal from a council committee. The previous sanctions, obviously, as you referred to, you could suspend a councillor for up to 6 months, and the the top tier judgment, the first tier tribunal could disqualify a councillor for up to 5 years. So they were extreme sanctions. The Committee on Standards and Public Life, we've already looked at previously in the committee, have recommended that the sanctions are increased, but that's going to require legislative change. The government have yet to formally respond to those recommendations, so we await that to see whether they are planning on doing that or not. I think there's certainly a lot of opinion in local government across all the political groups that sanctions need to be looked at again. But as to what happens and what comes out in the wash, it'll be down the line. We're left with what we've got at the moment legally.
Thank you, Mohammed.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. It's similar on a point saying, you know, I refuse to take training. What are you going to do? You know, it's that type of mentality. You'd hope that, you know, if someone who's an elected councillor would adhere to that advice. However, you know, like Nick's saying, over the years, I can think of some people who probably may have not thought of it. I just think, you know, in order to put confidence of the public backing in us as well, we've got to have some way of saying, well, actually, we can govern ourselves, we can give sanctions, and they will work. But I think the sooner that happens, the better it will be, because I can imagine when this goes out to the public, those who are interested will look at it and think, well, actually, if I put in a complaint, nothing really will happen. And then once we know that there are sanctions that are possible, then I think the public will probably have more, you know, look at us in a better light as well.
I would add on that point, just as an aside, I'll come to you in a second, Councillor Allen, that I would hope within political groups we could influence the behaviour of members in both withdrawal of the whip or indeed expulsion from the group, and no reselection of people that commit and won't adhere to the spirit of take the training and you refuse. Well, then perhaps political groups should consider whether that person should be or remain a member of that group. So that is one way that we can give confidence to the public in those circumstances, that if people did do bad things or wrong things, we should take the moral ground with them through the political process if the sanctions aren't tough enough through the Council's Code of Conduct. Just a thought. Steve Allen.
Thank you, Chair, Leader. Probably I'm asking a question that's blindingly obvious with its answer. On page 19, Part 1, General Provisions, this seems to be brevity at its best. That paragraph that's been struck through, not paragraph, that section that's been struck through, seems to be the potted answer to how we behave. Why has it been struck through? And can you give me some context on that, please?
So Part 1 General Provisions is essentially the Nolan Principles. It's not been taken out, it's just been reworded, so it's put the onus, it's using the word I rather than you. So it's repeated on page 18. So those principles, the Nolan Principles, are on pages 17 and 18 instead of on page 19. So it's just a slightly different rewording of them, okay?
It did fox me as well, Councillor Allen. I had the same comments, but so slightly confusing in terms of just the way it's laid out, but a lot of the stuff has been repositioned elsewhere in the document, not necessarily taken out. So as Fiona said, it's much the same as previous, but the formatting of the document perhaps is slightly confusing. Yeah. Sure. Any other questions? Oh, no, I think that's great. I think, Nick, I agree with you, again, broadly, that we've got to try it. It's been through enough scrutiny. Let's try it. And if it's not working, it's within the gift of the committee and the council to tweak things that perhaps might need a change upon reflection. So let's go forward with the spirit of cooperation on this and give it a try, see how it works. It's all meant to do the right thing, and where there are shortcomings, look to ourselves to maybe, as I say, political pressure if people don't want to play ball. Go on, Nick, final point.
Just want to make one final point. I agree with what the Chairman said, what you've said, Mr. Chairman. But I think quite a lot of the onus on this and quite a lot of the responsibility is on the monitoring officer, because I would hope that our monitoring officer and our deputy monitoring officer would set a fairly high threshold for what complaints are taken through the process, because one of the problems with the pre-2010 legislation was there was no discretion. So these really trivial complaints got taken through and went to the National Standards Board and took weeks and months to sort out. So I would hope that the monitoring officer would sort of exercise her discretion on that.
If you want to add anything, Fiona, by all means, but I can say that I think that happens now.
It definitely happens now. But there are some that may on paper look trivial, but actually are sometimes quite tricky to sort out, and sometimes only an investigation can get to the root of something. But certainly I absolutely try not to go down that route, along with the independent person who don't forget sits beside me in making those decisions as to whether or not it's in the public interest to go to have an investigation or not of these complaints.
Lovely. Okay, no more comments then, I don't see, so we can turn to the recommendations on page 11. Which we have considered and debated the amendments proposed for inclusion with the City Council's Code of Conduct Appendix 1, and to recommend adoption by full council. Do I have a unanimous agreement on that first one? Yep, okay. And 2, where available, to note the LGA's guidance, which it is now, on the new model code, and if appropriate to recommend the implementation alongside any associated revisions to the code. Are we all happy with that as well? Okay, agreed. There we go. Marvellous. We can move on to item number 5 swiftly then, which are criminal record checks for members and co-opted members. I think Amy is doing this, so welcome Amy, and you fire away.
Thank you. Good evening, members. So the sort of origin of this report is to try and address the need for some consistency in the way that we approach criminal records checks, and having regard to what other councils do, and just sort of looking at policies generally to see where we fit with that. And that was sort of the precursor to the production of this report and this document for your consideration. So you will unfortunately have seen that the first version of the report included every possibility that we could potentially include, but that a separate policy has since been circulated within the last 24 hours that curtails that at the moment to the Corporate Parenting Committee. And one of the recommendations of the report is that members consider this evening whether or not you'd like to broaden that list if indeed you're interested in implementing the policy at all. So in that regard, the policy currently proposes that checks are only carried out in relation to those members, and that the level of test that's required for that is a without barred list disclosure. And there are, of course, contained within the report and the policy other options that can be considered on a case-by-case basis in consultation with the monitoring officer. But we've tried not to sort of get ourselves into a position where we're saying that we have a sort of blanket policy of having a standard or a basic check in relation to everyone, but really just looking to see when is it most likely to be necessary, but also building in the possibility of exceptions to that normal premise where it's considered appropriate by Fiona and member services colleagues. So it's not a huge introduction from me because a lot of it's sort of set out in the report, but happy obviously to take questions or address any concerns anyone has got.
Lovely. Questions from anybody? Oh, Nick, straight out the traps again, straight away.
Yeah, I have to admit, when I was reading the agenda at the weekend, my heart sank when I saw this. And the reason it did is that I'm also, in one of my other activities, I'm an active member of a local church in the Church of England. And I think it's not unfair to say the Church of England has been almost like tearing itself to pieces over these issues, and it's actually got to the because the Church of England has had a number of issues with, you know, children being interfered with in all sorts of appalling ways, and so, as often happens in those situations, there's now been a complete sort of reaction to that, and some of us would argue it's been quite an extreme reaction, where you've now even got situations where 85-year-old ladies who are serving cups of tea and coffee in a church hall are required to undergo enhanced DBS checks. So I think we need to avoid that situation. I think I'm happier with the revised version of the report than I was with the original one, because I think, you know, you could construct an argument to say that all councillors should have a basic DBS check, because all that does is that checks whether you've had any current convictions. But there's also a contrary argument that says that if you'd had a conviction within the last 5 years that involved more than 3 months in prison, you'd be debarred from becoming a councillor. So that I wouldn't have a problem with that. Where I do have more of an issue is about this suggestion of councillors having to have enhanced DBS checks. And I think, you know, you can look at the wording of the Police Act, which is quoted in here, and it talks about, you know, you can require an enhanced DBS check for councillors who are involved in the discharge of a function in relation to adults and children. Now that I've had an email discussion with Fiona about what the discharge of a function actually means, but that is not, and there are a number of councils that actually require councillors on a whole series of committees that deal with aspects of adults and children to have enhanced DBS checks. But personally, I feel that is an extreme response, because the purpose, the fundamental purpose of DBS checks, if you read all the guidance on it, is to actually require enhanced checks on councillors, or not on councillors, on individuals who have a significant amount of regular unsupervised contact with vulnerable adults or with children. And I would respectfully suggest to the committee that, you know, somebody serving on the Children's Scrutiny Committee does not have a significant amount of regular unsupervised contact with children, or certainly on the occasions I've been on that committee, it hasn't been the case. You know, I don't know much about the cabinet, what individual cabinet members do. I suppose it could be that, you know, the cabinet member for children's services may have occasions when they have to go into unsupervised contact with children. So I think there is a case for it there. I think there's possibly a case for the corporate parenting committee, because I know they, as individuals, you know, take on like champion roles in respect to certain categories of children. But you know, I think it would be completely inappropriate to do it for all councillors, and be completely inappropriate to do it just because somebody's on a scrutiny committee. And just want to finally just say why I have concerns about these enhanced checks, because there's a charity called Unlock which is concerned about people who at times in the past have had brushes with the criminal law or convictions for various things, and they're concerned that these people should not be subject to unreasonable bad treatment or discrimination. And the problem with enhanced checks is that it doesn't only disclose current convictions, it doesn't only disclose convictions from a substantial period ago. It can go back up to 10 or 12 years. But there's also additional information, and what the guidance actually says, it says about that it may disclose other information that is known to the police. So it could be that, you know, if you'd had an interview with the police about some issue, that if a person in a local police station looking at one of these checks actually thought that was relevant, they could disclose it. It can also be included if you've had a fixed penalty notice. So if 10 years ago you had a fixed penalty notice for dropping a piece of paper in Cathedral Square, that could be revealed. So I think we do have to be really careful that, because I absolutely think that everybody who has got significant contact with adults, vulnerable adults, or with children should have one of these checks. But we also need to protect people who aren't in those situations from having unnecessary checks, because I don't know what it's like in other parties, but certainly in the Liberal Democrats we often have difficulty persuading people to become councillors. And just finally, going back to the church issue, there's quite a good friend of mine who has had to resign from the parochial council of his local church because when he was a child he actually had an issue came up with the police, and he doesn't want that to be disclosed to people in the church. So, those are the situations that I think we need to take a sensible approach. We need a balanced approach. We need to protect vulnerable adults and children, but also protect the rights of individuals as well. So sorry that was rather long.
Anybody else? Okay. May surprise you, I agree with you, Nick. In principle, I think you're right. We do have to be cautious about public and vulnerable adults. That's a responsibility that we have as a corporate body and indeed as individual councillors. So again, I think the suggestion is, and Fiona will correct me if I'm wrong, that we should just do it where there is a clear case that there might be, and I'm talking about the enhanced now, a risk, and we must mitigate that risk, because if we didn't and then we were, shall we say, caught short by something we'd missed, that would be unforgivable on our part, that we hadn't taken the necessary steps to make sure that people were safe who were vulnerable. But I think the suggestion is it is just a DBS check, not an enhanced one, for members of corporate parenting and the like. But in theory, and I agree with you as well, Nick, corporate parenting applies to us all. But there is a, we know there is a specific committee that generally meet. So Fiona, do you just want to clarify, in light of Nick's comments as well, what the proposal is at the moment, because we have discussed it, and what we've heard so far are some thoughts. So your recommendations in terms of, because it does say for us to decide or debate.
Yeah.
Are we saying, because I don't think we're saying give every councillor a DBS check, I don't think, because you're right, that's covered really mostly in the application to be a councillor, that you are barred for certain reasons anyway. So are we saying that we would want the scrutiny committee to have a standard DBS, corporate parenting committee, not scrutiny committee standard, and the corporate parenting enhanced? Could you just tell me the difference between what we're actually suggesting, then we can decide what we want to do?
Well, I think we were very much waiting for a steer from the committee tonight before making any sort of officer recommendations. I think the draft policy, and Amy will correct me if I'm wrong, was recommending...
Sorry, Amy, I should have come to you. Sorry.
That we don't do a basic disclosure check across the whole board, but only where a member's activities might put them into a category where they would need that. So if they were visiting residents in their own homes, is that what we're talking about? Where they would have access to young people or children, I think that might be something that we might want to do. But we need to take your views on that. So that was what the draft says at the moment. And then in terms of the enhanced check, I think we were suggesting that it would be corporate parenting members along with the cabinet members responsible for both children and vulnerable adults, along with cabinet advisors, if their roles were to take them into contact. Am I right? Please
Amy, do you
correct
want
me
to
if I'm wrong.
come? Do you want to come in?
No, that is correct, absolutely correct. So it is an enhanced, but without barred list check
Yes.
For the corporate
Which is the
parenting
highest one,
committee.
yeah.
Well, the very highest one is an enhanced with barred list check,
right, okay,
which
yeah,
we
sorry.
recognise in the
So it's
policy.
the one, the lower one.
The
before
slightly
that.
lower
Okay,
one
yeah.
than that, but not the very lowest. So that's in relation to corporate parenting, and then there was a suggestion that the relevant portfolio holders and potentially
Sure.
cabinet advisors would have the
Well,
same.
well, on the basis of what you've just said, before I let Nick come back in, there are occasions where we all, as councillors, in normal times, have visited people at home who may well be vulnerable, or they may have children in the home, which, that's happened to me. I'm sure it's happened to many other people. So we'll park that one for a moment, just give that some thought. Nick and then Mohammed wanted to come in, then Steve.
Yeah, I just have a concern that what Amy said is not what the wording actually says. It says that an enhanced DBS check in respect of every member assigned to the corporate parenting committee. So that's every member without any risk assessment being carried out. And then it also says all member of such future eligible committees (brackets relevant committees) which the monitoring officers should consider should be included. Now, that is giving a draconian power to an officer to basically prohibit councillors from serving on certain committees without any councillor input to that. So I think what I personally would like to see is, before any enhanced checks are required, that a proper risk assessment is carried out and have a look at what the responsibility of corporate parenting committee is. Is it normal that they go out and have unsupervised contact with adults and children? I don't know, because I'm not on that committee. Is that the case? And somebody who's a cabinet member? I think that's the process I would like to see, rather than this bland wording which just gives power to the monitoring officer effectively to impose these requirements.
Do you want to respond to that first? Then we'll come to Mohammed.
So it's just a sort of brief response which hopefully provides some reassurance. I mean, the wording there was designed to sort of future-proof the decision that you make this evening, in case there are committees which assume responsibilities that engage the principles of the policy. And the process that we envisage would be followed in that situation is that we obtain the check, and then once we receive the result of it, if it raises any cause for concern, then we would conduct the risk assessment that's set out in the policy to see whether or not the responsibilities of that councillor properly engage that concern. And then the monitoring officer would have to consult the leader of the relevant group before any decision could be taken to say that that person was no longer eligible to serve on that committee. So we sort of recognise that it would have to be something that was done in conjunction with members rather than just solely an officer decision.
Okay, Mohammed, please. Yeah, there you go.
Yep. I'm sort of looking at the recommendation, or what we're asked to do today, because the first part of it is consider the introduction of criminal record check for members and co-opted members. That to me says everyone. So I suppose, are we saying with that one that we're looking to introduce it for all 60 councillors?
No, I don't think so. I think our debate, which is why I went to Fiona first, will inform how far we think we should go collectively, and that's just general debate, and that's that will inform
I agree
what the
with
recommendation will be.
What you said at the start, and what Nick has alluded to, that you would think by the time someone gets to the chamber. But then there's also circumstances where things may happen after you're an elected member, and then between that and maybe you're part or then taking action, or you've kept it quiet and no one knows. So just going to park that for now, and then whether the enhanced ones without the barred list. I don't know whether, people on corporate parent actually, have that much to whether they go out and do that work, whether everyone does or whether everyone needs to. So I think how we recommend today, we need to be quite careful, because we might end up with a list where people may not want to sit on that committee for that reason, and then you think, why are they doing that? So I think it's important what we recommend today, works for us as a council, because it's important that we have this in place, but it's also important that we protect some of our colleagues as well in that sense, from stopping them from sitting on a committee that maybe they think, well, I don't want, like you said, I don't want something digging up something from when I was 12 when I'm now 60. But I just think we've got to be very careful when doing this.
Thanks. Steve was next.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I mean, you're absolutely right, Mohammed. I think that if we're not too careful, we'll be overcautious. Caution is very important, but if we're overcautious, then it will put people off getting involved in civic life and serving on committees. I mean, surely it's very relevant to how frontline anybody is. If you're a healthcare worker, then you have to be checked, I would imagine, for doing those kind of jobs. But as a counsellor, generally you are in the company of a carer or someone else supporting that person. So how many checks do you have to do on someone just to be there, be present, rather than actively involved in the issue? So I would like more clarity. I mean, I think in principle, yeah, okay, we'll all get checked to make sure that we're good boys and haven't got criminal records, but I think the enhancement of the checking is very relevant to the conversation we're having.
Thanks. Just some other observations, because obviously I mean, I was fairly open-minded about it all. One of the things I did bring into the equation was cost, by the way, which there is a cost to doing all this. It's not huge numbers, I know, but it's still a cost. And to spend money unnecessarily would seem to be a bit odd. The numbers can be flushed out, but it's about, I think it was £43, wasn't it, Fiona, for an enhanced one?
£40 for an enhanced check and 23 for the basic.
Okay, so Mohammed, you were next. Oh, you okay. Nick, back to you.
I just wanted to make a suggestion as to how to take it forward, because the other thing I was a bit concerned about was, this is coming to this committee today and then it's going to full council on the 28th. So I think this to actually introduce this is quite a major change, and I think that all councillors should be consulted about this. I was slightly concerned about what Amy was saying about almost that you get the checks and then you do the risk assessment. I would argue it the other way. I would say you should look at the role and responsibility somebody has and do a risk assessment as to, what the likelihood of regular unsupervised contact with vulnerable adults or children is. So could we actually not recommend this to go to full council on the 28th of July, but sort of ask officers to go through the different roles, like the corporate parenting committee, like the cabinet member for children's services, like the cabinet advisor, and then rather than coming up with a policy that says that you can basically add any committees on that you want to, actually come up with a list of roles that we feel these enhanced checks ought to be suitable for, and then maybe you could add in a caveat at the end about and that others could be added on some future occasion. That would be my suggested way forward.
Can I just add some clarity? Go on, Nigel. Before I wrap up.
Sorry, just very quickly. I'm surprised that councillors don't have a standard DBS check. I think all councillors, I would expect the public would expect that. To be honest, I'm shocked we don't have to at the moment. That's just my personal view. Not enhanced, but just a standard one.
Which is why I said earlier, I'm completely relaxed about these things. I don't get vexed about them in the sense that, but I understand Nick's points about they can be limiting and they'd be quite worrying for people that somebody did something at 11. I mean, I wouldn't like people to know what I did at 11. But the fact is that it might be best to take a step back, because I think there's some uncertainty about the risks involved and who the risks are with. Because, as Fiona could comment, that, quite often children in care come into the scrutiny meeting For example, yes, they're supervised, but what about when they go to the loo? Or there is risk, and if you miss something, but you're right, Steve, there is an overcautiousness, but we have a responsibility to people in our care and to vulnerable adults. But I think probably, if we're all saying the same thing, it might be best just to withdraw it today. And can I also say to you, what you need to understand is where this paper came from, because it doesn't say. And it's come from an officer who has close contact and responsibility for working with children and vulnerable people, who's an excellent officer. I won't name the person, but it's come from the right place, if you see what I mean. But if we want more time to reflect on who it should apply to and drill down into the detail of what, in real terms, is that exposure? Because you could argue, as I said, that sometimes we put ourselves in positions where we might find it uncomfortable if we turned up on a casework visit, that we could be put in an awkward position. So that's some summary. Do you want to just say a couple of things, Fiona?
Yes, and that referral from that officer has come from those of you who may or may not have read the inspection report of Rotherham Borough Council, which highlighted, that's 2015, but there's been subsequent inquiries obviously since then in 2018, but they highlighted the fact in the inspection report that members had not been DBS checked consistently and highlighted this as a weakness in the authorities' system. Now, in those cases, obviously, there were councillors who were going in and visiting children's homes, and I don't know whether that's the case in Peterborough, whether there is that level of access.
Well, well then if we don't know, we need to find out.
Exactly.
So I think we should find out from officers, and indeed our own group members, whether they feel that they are at risk of, shall we say, challenge, that if we haven't done the right things, then we would be held accountable. So should we just step back from it? Is that what we're all saying today? Yeah, I think we can just do that by common agreement, really. Just pending further analysis of the risks involved and the people it might apply to. Is that fair? There we go.
I'm very grateful for that. I think that I would have had great difficulty supporting this in its current form if it had gone to full
I think it comes from a good place and an officer place, and I did actually, Fiona had alerted me to the Rotherham fact, but it just slipped my mind. So I think we have to be mindful of that, but let's just reassess it in terms of who it might apply to, why it might apply to them in our own circumstances, and then bring it back for just another conversation with a little bit more detail. Are we agreed on that? Yeah. Okay, well done. Great. So the recommendation then is that we defer this paper for further information, and we'll bring it back to another committee with a view, if we can agree going forward, it would then go to full council, if you've captured that. Okay, the update on the petition scheme then is next, item 6, and again we've got a choice, Fiona or Pippa. I'm not sure. Is it your turn, Pippa?
I think it's my turn.
Oh, lovely.
Yes.
There we go.
Thank you, Chair. Evening, members. So yes, I'm presenting a report tonight in relation to the petition scheme. Those members who were on the committee last year may recognise the report. It came previously in October as part of a sort of scheme of proposals. At the time, members weren't minded to take the proposals forward, but asked us to keep a review of it. So this is the proposal coming back for your reconsideration. What we are asking committee to consider is an addition to the petition scheme, where it sets out in paragraph 4.4 of the report what we're proposing, and that is to add a further criteria for petitions to be rejected, and that would be if they're related to a decision by the council that has already been taken. And this really arises from offices and from members who are dealing with responses to petitions where the council is having to put forward a response to something that they can't take any action on practically. So really it is essentially just a sort of officer and member time-saving scheme where really there is no route for the public to get the kind of response that they want, and therefore just making the petition scheme a bit more practical and a bit more realistic for members and officers. So really that's it in a nutshell. Just to highlight some examples from the report, we've been talking about the erection of a fence around Ken Stimpson, which is an issue where we had a few petitions that came in. Really, there was no action that we could practically take. Other situations included, I think we had a number of petitions on the faith school decision, which was something that, again, the cabinet member didn't feel that they could actually take any action on, as the decision had already been taken at that point. So yes, for members to consider, and happy to take any questions.
Third time. Oh, away you go, Nick.
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm going to be awkward over this one as well, because I think, you know, let's look at the examples that were given. The example of the faith school, I think that, you know, comes under bullet point number 4 in 4.4, that it relates to a function that the council is not responsible for. So that's that one. I think, you know, I can see from an administrative convenience angle, it would be nice to say if a decision's already been taken, therefore a petition can't be received on it. But, you know, the vast majority of decisions that the council makes can be changed at some point. There are very few decisions that are decisions in perpetuity. There are some decisions that the council makes where it makes the decision in one capacity, but it also has another capacity. And the Ken Stimpson school one is a classic example of that, because the council there made a decision as a planning authority at the planning committee that this fence ought to be put up. But the council, and a petition was received, but the council also was the actual owner of the land on which that fence was being constructed. So the council didn't need to change its decision as a planning authority, but it could have changed its decision as the actual owner. I would also quote another very topical example that I've been dealing with only in the last few days, the issue of Rhubarb Bridge. Now, Rhubarb Bridge is a classic example where a decision was made by the council that Rhubarb Bridge should be demolished and At Great Crossing should come in. There was a 5,000 signature petition submitted, and the council changed its decision, and Rhubarb Bridge has been kept. The issue I've just been dealing with is that the council at the bottom of Rhubarb Bridge decided to put up no cycling signs. There was a massive outcry on Facebook, and the council has changed its decision, and the no cycling signs have been taken out. So I think, you know, I can't support this, and I'm pretty sure that members of our group wouldn't support it either, because, you know, it's actually creating a situation where we're unnecessarily restricting the ability that people have to put petitions forward.
Mohammed Jamil.
Thank you, Chair. I also think if we go ahead with this, then we'll also reduce, you know, I feel it's democracy, it's people's right to do this, and we're eroding that, we're restricting that to almost an extent where, you know, we're going to regulate everything, and the people already don't want to get involved, the public. This is one of the few areas where, you know, people get emotive, people want to do something, and I think if we go ahead with this, then we're restricting their right to protest, their right to get something changed, and therefore I'm struggling to support this.
Steve Allen.
Thank you, Leader. I'm going to violently agree with the previous 2 points. I think we need the oxygen of public opinion. As a council, we're duty-bound to listen to it, and I think that we would be vilified rightly if we didn't. However, in general, I'm happy with this, with the removal of that bullet point related to a decision by the council that's already been made. So that's what I would propose, that we accept this proposal, removing that item.
Okay, we haven't heard everybody though yet, Steve. That's fine.
I'm still allowed to put forward that
Yeah,
thought.
it's a notion,
Thank you,
fine.
Leader.
Sam, anyway, go on.
I was going to say, most of the general public don't tend to know what's happening at full council meetings until something's come out in the press, and then lo and behold we find that a petition has been started. So I would suggest that related to a decision by the council that has already been taken be removed from this document. Thank you.
Was there anybody else? Oh, Nick, do you want to come back?
Yeah, sorry, I don't know if Steve has actually looked at what the recommendation says, but the recommendation is, because the first 4 bullet points are what's already in the policy, so the recommendation is to add the 5th bullet point. So if I'm pleased you agree with what we're saying, but you may as well just withdraw the proposal. That's the best. Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? So, Fiona, do you want to comment, or Pippa, do you want to comment on any?
It's a matter for members at the end of the day. The only other option would be to add the words, and there is no possibility of a different decision being taken onto the end of that bullet point.
I was thinking the same thing, because I'll tell you why. Because, Nick, the example you gave about the land would not be to petition the authority to change the planning decision, but it would be a petition to the authority not to sell the land, which is not the same thing. I think we're kind of agreeing.
The council actually owns the land. That's
but what I'm saying is the petition being submitted about the planning decision is not the one that the petitioners should submit to change. They should petition the council then not to allow the development or not to allow the land. So it doesn't prevent people in those circumstances. My personal view is, and Fiona articulated it, is that, and there are some decisions that can't be changed, certainly for a period of time. Once the decision has been made, you can't change it. What's the period, generally, Fiona? If council makes a decision to do something, it can't come back to council for 6 months.
But no, if it can.
I'm just asking for clarification, Nick. In general terms, it's 6 months.
I'm thinking more of a planning decision where it's out of the council's remit and would have to go through the planning appeal process, so a petition would not be the right mechanism for doing that. But if, for instance, in the Faith School, I know Councillor Sandford just said it would be covered by the 4th bullet point down, but actually it was a function that the council made a decision on. But the point was, the decision had been made and things had been actioned in terms of that it was too late to go back on. So a petition wouldn't have affected that decision. So there is no possibility of a different decision being taken. Do you see what I'm trying to cover with that?
So I have some sympathy with all points of view, and I'm sure we don't want officers doing things that we cannot possibly reverse, or there is no outcome from the petition. So how do we find a way through this to get people, not to stifle people's right to petition, but not to waste time on things that are not possible to deliver because of the law or any other reason. So if anybody's got a suggestion that we can make an amendment to that where we're all happy, let's just talk about how we can do that, because I know, Nick, as well, you won't want them doing something. There is no possible way that whatever the petition says could influence a decision that's already been taken, and there could be, we can talk about all night about examples of it, but in other circumstances there may well be, but it may have to be a slightly different petition, so as in the land one, not the planning permission. Steve.
Can Fiona just repeat the addition to that clause that she put forward, because that may be the way out of the conversation.
That's what I'm suggesting.
Well, so the bullet point says, related to a decision by the council that has already been taken, and I'm suggesting adding, and there is no possibility of a different decision being taken.
would that be subjective, that addition? Is that tight enough in legal terms?
I think so. In the sense of that a decision has been made and so actions have been taken on the basis of that decision from which there's no coming back from. For instance, a property has been sold and it's done, the deal is done. It's more about managing to be fair, this is more about managing expectations of members of the public who believe that when they put a petition in, that there's some possibility that something's going to change. And when you say, yes, technically, because it's not in the scheme, that we can turn it down, you can do a petition, and then there's nowhere for that petition to go, it actually is counterproductive.
I'll give you a more recent example, which Sam will be familiar with. The Fengate Mobile Home Park put a petition in after the planning permission had been granted for the Drug and Alcohol Rehabilitation Centre. It serves no purpose whatsoever. But it's taking up officers' time to deal with that petition. It would be better if others, were minded to recommend another petition or do something, but you can't reverse that decision. It's been done. It's been actioned. So it's disappointing, and Sam, you'll know, because those people wanted, what was the point of the petition, they asked. I saw an email because, unfortunately, the expectations of the public were that something could be done about that. And if we said at the outset, I'm very, very sorry, you can't do that now, the time to do it would have been beforehand, and that would have been realistic. So there are lots of examples like that, and we could sit here all night and talk about them. Go on, Sam.
That was because of the lack of consultation to the residents living in that park. So obviously around the planning rules, there's only certain residents got told they lived closer to the Verve Hotel. They wasn't aware of the planning permission that said some people that lived further down in houses were advised. So it was about
we won't get into who told what about who, because planning colleagues are not here. They will tell you that they did what was required. Whether that was good enough, I don't know. However, it still doesn't get round the fact that what they subsequently did, they're now disappointed about, which is what the point of this is, really, because no decision can be reversed in that case. Go on, Nick, come back in, please.
I was thinking about some wording along the lines of if it was not legally possible to reverse a decision, but then I was also just thinking about what Councillor Jamil was saying. I thought he made a very good point about, sometimes people put a petition forward not in an expectation that the council's going to reverse its decision, but because they want to protest about the fact that a particular course of action has been taken. And so I think that I am slightly concerned about trying to prescribe precise circumstances when we're not going to even permit a petition to be received. So I think on balance I prefer that this were not inserted, but if it's going to be in there, I think the wording needs to be really precise, because the wording that Fiona was talking about, that it's not possible for the decision to be reversed. Well, is it not possible because the cabinet member might not be inclined to agree to it being reversed? So that wording is so open to.
Well, we'll give Fiona a chance to think about it.
I'm quite happy with your wording, Councillor Stanford. That's fine. To not legally possible to reverse a decision is absolutely fine too.
Well, just before we move to any decision, Sam, you want to come back in?
Yeah, I was just going to say, with some petitions, obviously the Rhubarb Bridge one, that changed how the Rhubarb Bridge went. With the petitions that other people in, potentially that could change how other things have done. So like the planning over the Verve Hotel, that potentially could open doors where actually we need to consult with more residents who live in that area by having the petitions, by extending more consultations to people. Does that make sense?
It does, but I'm not sure that's necessarily the route that should go through.
No.
That is about changing the statutory consultees or consultation area with planning. No petition will do that. The other thing about people's right to protest, Nick, is a petition may not be the best way to do that, particularly if you're left afterwards with an expectation, and you could say some people don't expect anything, but generally speaking, people expect something from a petition. So I'll come to you, Steve. So I agree with what we're trying to achieve. It's just trying to achieve a balance again of how we do that, and I think we're kind of almost there. Steve, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I'm effectively echoing what you've just said. I put my hand up before you said it, but
Sorry.
I think a petition must have a realistic chance of the requested outcome being achieved. And I don't know what words you're going to do. You're the legal officer to put those words together. But I think we could agree on the principle of that being amended with the right form of words.
So, Fiona, do you want to read out what you've got so far, and let's see if we can get everybody on the side? Because I think nobody wants people not to be able to approach the council and make their points, but petitions are not necessarily always the way to do them. So if somebody's unhappy about a decision, Nick, in your ward, well, bring them in. Not all of them, but just a few generally, and let's have a chat about it. Putting a petition that they then have to process and manage is that achieves nothing. But anyway, go on, Fiona. You've got something.
Oh, okay, so the first set of wording was, and there is no possibility of a different decision being taken. Councillor Sandford is suggesting, and it is not legally possible to reverse a decision, which is sort of still achieving the same aim. So we're talking about where a decision's been made, and for instance, a land sale or something has happened. It's set in stone. It's concrete. So that legal transaction has taken place for whatever reason. That's the sort of situation that we're trying to cover here.
Yeah.
So,
can we agree that? Can we agree that? Come on, Nick. Let's make it 3 out of 3.
Yeah, I'm actually looking at what Councillor Jamil says, because he raised the point about the democratic process. I think I do get concerned sometimes when Mr. Chairman, when you say let's not raise something at full council. Let's have a nice chat about it. Well, people don't elect us as councillors to behind the scenes have a nice chat about it.
I'll elaborate further. Okay. You're welcome to raise any matter with me at full council. But in order to conduct the business as quickly as we can, I'm just suggesting sometimes it may not be the only outlet to do it. And petitions are definitely not always the way to do it, particularly when they don't achieve an outcome and leave people feeling frustrated. So can we agree the words? Are we all agreed? I think Mohammed is looking to you.
I still am uncomfortable with that, I have to be honest with you.
You can
I think the problem is that out there people will not I understand what you say, but for some people that's the way they know and that's the way they want to do it, and then we're restricting their right to do it. And I totally understand it might not be the best way of doing it, but I just think if this is in there, that is one course of action that's knocked out for them.
Could I just add to that? 'Cause if you look at the other things in that paragraph, petitions will not be considered if they are abusive. Well, obviously, we don't want abusive petitions, or we don't want petitions that are vexatious, that are particularly, want to get at somebody because of some malicious purpose, or want to create mischief, or relate to a function that the council is not responsible for. Well, we don't really want those either. But I just wonder that this is taking the restriction a bit further and saying that, yeah, I don't have a strong view on it. I think I'll probably abstain on it if it goes to a vote.
Right, so members, I was hoping we'd get a unanimous amendment. So this is what I'm going to suggest. So we can either go with the policy as was, or we can either go with the policy as now amended. So on the first suggestion, which Just remind me what it said again, Fiona, because my thing's gone off.
We're suggesting the addition of a bullet point which says that a petition will not be considered if it is related to a decision by the council that has already been taken, with the addition of these words, and it is not legally possible to reverse that decision.
Okay, so firstly, I'll just want to take a vote on whether we want to go with the recommendation as originally proposed. So who's in favour of that? Nobody. Hang on. As proposed. So I'm now moving to the... so nobody. Okay, fine. Well, at least we know where we are. So now, can I ask for a vote then on the recommendation as amended by Councillor Sanford, which is, unless legally, whatever it is...
not legally possible to reverse that decision.
Who's in favour of that? Oh, come on, but who's in favour of the new proposal? Nobody. Right. So, have you got a better form of words, Councillor Allen?
I'm not the legal officer, but I would have thought something along the line related to a decision by the council that's already been taken and cannot be realistically overturned, or something of that nature. It's not a legal terminology, but I'm sure something like that, which makes it worth its while being turned over. Officers can achieve it, and we can come out with an outcome. I think legal is the wrong word, because there are things that are a little bit more subjective than the term legal.
So you've got a new proposal. Did you capture it, Fiona?
Well, the starting thing was, and there is no possibility of a different decision being taken. You could add, and there is no realistic possibility of a different decision being taken. Does that sum it up?
There we go. Well, so we are now on the third suggestion of realistically being. Is it altered or overturned?
Chair, it's the same thing again. It's realistic. I mean, exactly. So
okay.
It's not realistic to overturn it because the Conservative have a 30-seat majority on the council or something.
Can I have a vote on that? You proposing it? Have I got a seconder for that? Nigel. Right, that's proposed and seconded. So, show of hands on who's voting for it. Anybody against? Oh, I thought you were abstaining.
On the other proposal, but
See what you've done, Councillor Allen? You've gone from an abstention to an against. So that is 4 in favour and 3 against. But it's all been done in the nicest possible way, hopefully. So whilst not perfect, I agree. I hope people recognise that it's coming with good intent from the officers, and we will not want to stifle debate or petitions where they are realistically able to be carried through.
Check, is that a recommendation to full council?
I believe it would be.
Okay, right.
That is correct, isn't it? I believe it would be. Okay, so we move on to item, it is number 9, the Council Code of Conduct report. Or is it? No, it's update on national issues according to this. No, it's not even that either. It's dispensations.
It's just a note that there haven't been any.
A note that there haven't been any. An update on national issues, and the only one was the model that was discussed at item 4, which has previously been circulated. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself, that's why. So the Council Code of Conduct report, and I think, again, is it Amy or Fiona? Fiona will do this, thanks.
Thank you, Chair. So this is your usual update report on complaints that have been handled by myself or Amy since the last meeting. So we have had 4 new complaints about city councillors, 1 new complaint about a parish councillor. We have, you might have noticed, started using numbers to refer to these cases as they are. There's quite a number of them, and it's easier to track them with a a specific case number on them. So that's why we've started using those. And then ongoing complaints. So there are no ongoing complaints in relation to city councillors, but there are 5 new complaints in relation to parish councillors. I should add that those all arise out of one parish council. And then concluded complaints, there are 5 concluded complaints about city councillors and 2 concluded parish councillor complaints. And then finally, at 4.4 of the report, you'll see that the investigation report into a complaint by a member against a member of City Council has been concluded with a breach finding, and the recommendation was that an apology was offered, which it has been, and the report is there for your information. And that's really it.
Marvellous. Does anybody have any comments or want to say anything? Nick, again, please.
Yeah, I just, I'm not going to comment on the individual case that's listed in the report, but, I just cringed when I actually read through that. And I just think that, we do need a really high threshold to be applied, because I actually know that was one of a series of complaints of, like, tit for tat between those 2 councillors. So I just urge a really high threshold to be applied, particularly when it's a complaint of one councillor complaining against another councillor.
Thank you very much. I don't see anybody else. So we'll note the report on complaints received or being handled by the monitoring officer since the committee's last meeting on the 8th of February. So moving on to item... Oh, sorry, Dan. Go on.
Let's just going to move on to me next.
Oh, I thought you were going to stop me for something. Moving on to item 10, which is the Councillor Code of Conduct report. And Dan Kelly here on my left is happy to...
It's the work programme report.
Oh, sorry? Oh, sorry, it is. It is. I've forgotten already again. You carry on.
Thank you. Thank you, Jay. So members are aware this is the work programme for the committee. So obviously I'll add in the DBS checks coming back at a later date. And then obviously if there's any other items members want on the agenda, and if so, you can tell me at any time and I'll add them to the agenda.
Councillor, unfortunately in mine it does say Councillor Code of Conduct report. Not that I was going to highlight it, but it does. Okay, Nick, did you want to add something or say something?
Yeah, it's more of a question really, because there's been a lot of discussion that has gone on at group leaders meetings about the agenda for full council and how we can get sufficient time for motions on there. And also that there's a new procedure that's been introduced for different categories of motion, and I think we agreed we needed to give that a try and see how it works. But I thought we'd agreed at some point it would be reviewed. So did it not need to come back to this committee at some point?
Maybe that hasn't filtered down to the team, Nick. To be honest, if because they're looking blank about it.
I think we agreed at group leaders that we would try it for 2 council meetings and then review it after that. So I don't know whether you want to have a discussion at group leaders and then bring a report back here, or see. We think we said 2 council, so it would be due to come to the next meeting if you wanted to look at it.
I think it really, I'm quite happy that we discuss it at group leaders meeting, but I'm always conscious, that's a private meeting, and these are really important issues about, having time to discuss things, and so I think maybe, discuss it at group leaders first, and then, but I think it
because if it's working well, we may not need to bring it here.
It could be working well. I don't know.
Let's be optimistic.
But I'm just considered, that this is the public forum, so I think we do need at some point for it.
No, that's fine. That's fine. I think if we base it on round 1 of the new scheme, it all went swimmingly well, and everybody was happy and feeling blessed at our last council meeting. So I hope that continues at the next one. That, I believe, is everything for tonight's meeting. So thank you all very much for attending, and I don't know when the next meeting is. Do we actually happen to know that, by the way, just for noting? It will be September 20th. There we are. Well done, Fiona. So it'll be September the 20th, but of course it'll go out in the usual way. So thank you all very much. Have a good evening, and that's it for now.